Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on our final No Way to Treat a Child webinar of 2020. Yay, we've made it this far. We hope that all of you have stayed healthy and that you're able to and we really appreciate that you're taking time tonight to talk with us about both our No Way to Treat a Child campaign and some of the work that my colleagues are doing at the American Friends Service Committee. Want to go to the next slide, please, Shayna? My name's Jennifer Bing, and I work with the American Friends Service Committee. And if this is your first time joining a No Way to Treat a Child webinar, you will soon be introduced to some of our staff who work with Defense for Children International Palestine, who are our partners in this work, who are leading a campaign in Congress to advocate for the rights of Palestinian children. And as you know, we've been following a bill in Congress, H.R. 2407. We're coming up on the last days of that bill. But we're excited that this campaign continues to gain momentum thanks to all of you who continue to engage with us. Next slide, please. So they will wave their hands hello. My colleague Miranda Cleland is here from Defense for Children International Palestine, and Shayna, who you know always gives us great, although sobering updates on children in detention, and of course Brad Parker, who leads the advocacy work and has been so instrumental in getting bills written in through Congress. And he'll be talking about some recent cases just this past week in terms of the occupation and its impact on children. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda for tonight. We are going to talk about a child death, a killing last week, give you some information about that, as well as a detention update on Palestinian children in detention. And then we are going to talk about why we brought these colleagues who do work to free them all here tonight to talk about their work in the U.S. And how we can be supportive of that. So why don't we start our evening? Thank you, Brad.
Yeah, so just kicking off with a couple updates on some recent cases and incidents that have been, I think, probably more attention than we're actually used to, sadly. So the case that I just want to touch on here at the top is 15-year-old boy, Ali Ayman Salah Abu Aliyah, who was killed on Friday during a demonstration in his village, shot in the stomach with live ammunition, and died shortly thereafter. It was actually his 15th birthday. There's been sort of a really overwhelming outpouring of support and attention to the case, I think particularly because he's young, his birthday, and I think also as a testament to the sort of changes that have happened over the year, particularly in the US, with just more awareness on what's happening on the ground, and how unjust, right, and oppressive Israeli occupation is, and sort of the Israeli military regime that Palestinians face. So we documented the killing and put out a brief news alert the other day. I think it should be popping up in the chat here if it's not there already. There's been some outpouring, I wouldn't say outpouring, there's been some statements and some tweets and some different sort of reactions, I think, to this killing that we haven't really seen to this level, right? It's still a very low level, but I think it's important to note the responses public calls for investigation coming from J Street, which is, really not interested in the accountability piece around rights. So, J Street calling for an investigation and linking the specific weapon that was used, a Ruger rifle, which is a US produced weapon, linking that to US provided military assistance to Israel. And you see that in Representative Betty McCollum's statement too. And I think this is really the link that we've been working to make throughout this, from the beginning of this campaign, is that American taxpayers, the American government is complicit in every detention, every killing of a Palestinian child by Israeli forces. Right? It's not something that's separate from what we're, what's happening in our lives in the U.S. We're very much perpetuating this and responsible. So we just want to flag this and note the responses that have happened so far. We'll keep working with members of Congress, I think, as we go into the next few weeks and lead up to the next Congress in January, and really trying to kind of use everything that we've done this year and years prior to build some momentum, to make a much stronger sort of base of support, so that these killings, right, that we chip away at the systemic impunity that does exist, that just allows this to happen. On a personal note, is this, I think, struck me a little bit more than usual. I started working at DCI Palestine in January 2013, and just thinking back to that time, that's really the start of where live ammunition started to be more prevalent in demonstrations, and really spiked in 2015 through 2016. And then we know in Gaza with the March of Return, how destructive and damaging that was to Palestinian life. So this is the 155th case that we've documented since I've been at DCI Palestine of a Palestinian child killed with live ammunition or crowd control weapons, right? And not one of those cases has there been any sense or any real accountability. And I think it's important, right? These calls for investigations, they're important, but you have to recognize too that the Israeli military is being asked to investigate itself, which we know the result will be. So I think that while we look forward to next year and look forward to the work that we're going to be creating and doing collectively, I want to just make space here to acknowledge the impunity that just allows this to go, and that many of members of Congress allow this and perpetuate it through their omission to act. So I'll leave it there and pass it to Shayna to sort of give an update on prisons and another specific case that we've been working on this week.
Yeah. So those of you, thanks, Brad, for that update. And those of you who tune into these calls monthly know that we like to provide an update just to give you an idea of who's in prison at any given time, or as up to date as we know. You might recall that the last webinar that we hadn't yet gotten updated figures since August of this year. And so almost like clockwork, the very next day, we finally got the September figures. So as you know, we don't have any idea of how many children exactly are detained each year. And that's because we don't have access to that information. The information we do have access to is that once a month, the Israel Prison Service basically does a head count. It's a snapshot of who's in prison on the last day of the month. So at the end of September, there were 157 children detained in Israeli prisons, and all of them were boys. 73% of those children were unlawfully transferred outside of the occupied Palestinian territory into prisons located inside of Israel. 18 of the children were between the ages of 14 and 15, and there weren't any children younger than that. And there also were 2 children being detained under administrative detention orders, which means that no charges have been filed, but they're being held indefinitely without charge. As Brad mentioned, we've been working on a case this week about a 16-year-old boy, involving a 16-year-old boy, Mohammed Mukbal. He was arrested about a little over a week ago on November 29th in Arub refugee camp around 9 in the morning. And after he'd been detained by an Israeli soldier, the soldier struck him in the face with a rifle stock and broke his jaw, broke his teeth, and then immediately after that, at least 3 soldiers started beating him, slapping him, kicking him. He was ultimately transferred to Etzion Detention Interrogation Center near Hebron, where he was kept outside, bound and blindfolded for basically an entire day, from about 10 or so in the morning until midnight at night. That night, and was brought in a couple of times for brief interrogations. He, of course, didn't have access to an attorney during his interrogation, and it wasn't until 3 in the morning, 18 hours after he'd been detained, that he finally was transferred to Hadassah Ein Kerem Hospital in Jerusalem, and that's where doctors examined him and x-rayed his face and saw that his jaw had been broken. The day after he arrived at the hospital, a judge at Ophir Military Court extended his detention so that charges could be filed, and ultimately charges were filed accusing Mohammed of stone throwing and throwing Molotov cocktails. The following day, Mohammed underwent surgery where they installed 4 screws in his jaw, as well as platinum to secure it. And then only a day after he'd undergone this surgery, he was transferred to Megiddo prison. There's a photo of Mohammed that we've included on the slides, and you'll notice that his legs were shackled together, and it's hard you can't tell in this photo, but his hands were also shackled, and his hospital room was guarded by soldiers until he was transferred to Megiddo prison. On December 6th, so on Sunday, he was granted bail, but the military prosecutor has appealed that decision, and so he has not been released, and he remains in pretrial detention. And his appeal hearing is scheduled for Thursday, for December 10th. So one of our attorneys is representing Mohammed, and we really wanted to highlight this story because even though nearly most children, the vast majority of children detained by Israeli forces are subjected to some form of physical violence. We've I think it was this year, we've had about 85% of children who've been detained have reported that they've been subjected to physical violence. This case is really unusual in the level of violence that and the severity of the injury, which is why we felt it was important to highlight and just make you aware. I also just want to flag that we had a case at the end of October where a child was actually killed due to excessive force, physical force, and was beaten, and ultimately an autopsy determined that the cause of death was asphyxiation. And so we are, while obviously live ammunition and crowd control weaponry are the leading causes of child fatalities in the occupied territory, that doesn't mean that children aren't experiencing violent beatings and other such things. So I think with that, I'm going to pass it back to Brad to provide a little bit of context about why we're bringing together the Free Them All movement with our No Way to Treat a Child campaign. Thank you.
Thanks, Shayna.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. Final thing, I'm sorry to interrupt, Brad, is that we are still running our COVID petition, calling for the release of all child detainees in light of the pandemic. And so we'll drop the link in the chat if people have not yet signed on to the petition in order to add their voice. So thank you. Sorry about that, Brad.
No, good to flag that for folks. What I want to just do very quickly, and then pass it to our wonderful guests that we're lucky to have, so you can hear from them for the rest of the hour. I want to set up and just explain why we thought this was relevant and important to blend these campaigns and these worlds. As you know, AFSC has been our partner from the beginning, and the real core of that stretches back to AFSC's strong work, I think stretching back to 1947 in Gaza with the first refugees in Gaza. And I think what we've learned over the years is that things aren't so different. We talk about Palestinian children. We represent Palestinian children in Israeli military courts. We talk about the military courts not being a justice system, right? There's this idea that legal frameworks and courts, are set up to hold individuals accountable for specific wrongdoing, and there's some sort of semblance of justice. And I think the thing that's become clear and that we've kind of worked to bring to the No Way campaign is that, right, these are political decisions, right? These are not sort of inherent truths and, that require incarceration or that's the only route. And I think over the past several decades, there's been a lot of work, maybe further on the margins than it should be. And we thought it was important to sort of bring an American, US-based perspective around prison abolition, around a future without incarceration, which is essentially what we're demanding for Palestinian children in our No Way to Treat a Child campaign, when we say that no child should be prosecuted in a military court. No child should be subject to military detention system that denies basic rights to due process, that's widespread ill treatment, all of these things, right? In the US, this is not very different, right? I've been in conversations with different folks in Atlanta. I know Jennifer has done this work in Chicago with Black youth, right, that are also targeted for arrests. Those experiences between, a 15-year-old in Chicago, a 15-year-old in Atlanta, and a 15-year-old in Palestine are all very similar, right? If you make them all generic, wipe the specific identifiers, you wouldn't really know which experience was from which place. And so I think that's the piece that we want to try to touch on tonight, and also just vision a little bit and think about what it means to actually release all people from detention, incarceration, and cruel sort of vengeful systems that are set up fairly recently, right? It hasn't always been like this. So to do that, I'll pass it to my partner in crime, Jennifer, to introduce her wonderful AFSC colleagues to help walk us through a bit more in detail.
Thank you, Brad. Yeah, I'm so excited to introduce the work of my colleagues. There are three people at AFSC that I really admire so much. Shayna said I would read their bios, but I think I'm just going to say something about each of them. Lewis, who's going to speak first, he's got that legal degree, so similar to Shayna and Brad, like that. That's kind of the background that he comes out of, being a law school graduate. But he is the coordinator for our Healing Justice program, and he's based in New York City, so also close to Shayna and Brad. And he really is a renowned expert on the school to prison pipeline, and really talking so poignantly about what the barriers are to successful reentry, and really how to engage all of us in cultivating activists and working for the release of children and all people held in detention. After Lewis, my colleague Kristen, whose title is Director of Human Migration and Mobility, HMM. And everyone who isn't at AFSC is always like, mobility, what so but basically Kristen works on immigration issues, certainly in this past 4 years under the Trump administration. Her work and the detention of immigrants has been really center. And I know a lot of people on our calls have often asked us about what about the kids in cages, and how do we make those links and comparisons. And Kristen has really done a lot of incredible work, and she's going to share some of the challenges and some of the victories that she's been a part of in the last 4 years. She also has, I didn't know about all her international experience until I read her bio about all her worldly travels in Rwanda, Nigeria, Russia, Mozambique, Philippines. Wow. Kristen, thanks for joining us. And last but not least is my colleague Peniel, who we get a chance to see when we go to Washington, D.C., where she is our engagement coordinator for our Office of Public Policy and Advocacy. She basically is really keeping tabs on all the horrible things that have been happening these last 4 years in Washington, D.C., but keeping us all up to date on legislation that moves forward, and how people in the grassroots can engage. And you've probably seen a lot of blog posts on our AFSC website, whether it's about immigration or so many issues she's been writing about. She's an immigrant from Nigeria, so you'll detect an accent. People always ask that, right, Peniel? So where are you from? As an immigrant herself, obviously this issue is close to her heart. So I'm going to stop gushing about my colleagues, but welcome them to this webinar, and please put your questions to them in the chat, and we'll get to that at the end. So Lewis, it's off to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And I always wondered about why mobility was in the name of your program, Kristen. Now that we know your travels, it's a little more obvious. I didn't know that about you. I want to thank the organizers of this webinar and all of you who are participating to join us in this very challenging moment. It is a moment that we are all trying to navigate in ways that we've never tried before. And it's one that we will survive. We have no choice. But it's one that, for me, and I think for many of us who do this work and think about these issues, amplifies one of the most egregious and horrible realities in the American criminal justice system. And that is how we treat our children. I come to this not just as a staff person with AFSC, but as a parent of 3 young men who, because of where they live and what they look like, have been targeted by this system their whole lives. We've been fairly lucky that we haven't had the impact that others in our community have had by the system. but to know every day that I have to worry about whether or not my 3 sons are going to come home, not because of crime that we typically think about, but because of state violence. And so I come to this conversation with that personal perspective, in addition to my clear commitment that the system that we're talking about has targeted my people forever, right? The origin of policing, we all know, are the slave patrols. The prisons were really designed to be a way of frightening slaves from thinking about running away. So when we talk about free them all, we're really talking about not just freeing people in the pains of a pandemic, but freeing us all from this punitive racist system that has led to the incarceration and over incarceration of people around the world. It's what we see in Palestine. It's what we see in Brooklyn. And so what I would love to share with you today is a little perspective on who we're talking about when we say free them all. In the United States, there are over 200,000 young people in our prisons. And I'm talking about people under the age of 18. Okay. The United States has a history of prosecuting children as adults when it comes to the criminal justice system. Up until a few years ago, if you were 13 and up in the United States, you could, in any state, face criminal charges that could put you in prison for the rest of your life. And it starts with a system that says, we are going to get you ready. We're going to get you ready for this prison system, and we're going to do it in your schools. Not all of your schools, but in the schools that house young people that are often Black and brown, we're going to train you how to be ready for prison. And we're going to do that by monitoring you in ways that children should never be monitored, where they go to learn. You can see in the image on the screen one of the most horrific experiences that I think a child can experience, and that is to be judged dangerous. That young lady is being told that she cannot enter her place of learning until she's determined to be safe for others. What that does is it cages our spirits. It cages their ability to learn. And so when we say free them all, this is one of the things we want people freed from. We want our children freed from the stereotypical responses that they face because they're poor, Black, and brown. And so the school to prison pipeline, which is certainly one of the reasons we have so many young people in our jails and prisons, is really designed to control. And once they enter the school, they are not just surrounded by loving teachers and caring counselors, but often by armed police officers. Police officers who are not trained to deal with child misbehavior. They're trained to look at everyone as a potential danger. And they respond when children do what children do. That image on the left is a very clear image of overreaction. And it's overreaction because that's what police are trained for, right? They're trained to respond violently to perceived violence. And when you put that reality in a school, you are destined for conflict, a conflict that will almost indefinitely lead to that child being suspended and then potentially expelled. And that takes the child to the next aspect of our criminal justice system. That was an invitation to move the slide. And that is getting caught up in the system itself. Okay. Why do we have so many young people in our prisons and jails across the United States? It starts with how they're policed. Okay. I don't know how many of you are from inner cities here in New York, but there's something in New York called stop and frisk and broken windows policing. Two very intentional strategies to target young Black men and where necessary to sweep up young Black women also and brown boys and girls. Stop and frisk has been something that's been in the news for a long time, and we said we mitigated it to some degree in New York, but the truth is that if you are a teenager and you're outside, you are more likely to be stopped by the police than anyone else in this society. And they're not stopping you because you've committed a crime. They're stopping you because of who you are, where you are, and what you look like. And that stopping often is super confrontational. And we all either have or remember being teenagers. And confrontation is not the place you want to put a teenager in, right? Though, especially young men where the The hormones are elevated and the defenses are already elevated. So we get this problem. And the problem leads to an arrest, and the arrest leads to long-term incarceration often. I had a conversation with the Commissioner of Corrections in New York State about a year ago. And he said to me, you know, our prison populations are going down, but we're still seeing a super uptick in teenagers coming in. And they're coming in with these ridiculously long sentences. And we don't know what to do with them because they come in angry. They come in with all of the realities of being young. And they're told that they're going to spend 30, 40, 50, if not the rest of their life in prison. And, you know, that's nothing other than our propensity to stereotype, our racist culture, and our fear of the other. And that's what we need to be free from. We need to free ourselves from all of the things that drive us to send young people to prison. And once we send them to prison, we often put them in the most horrific conditions, like solitary confinement. I worked very hard on a campaign about 3 years ago to end solitary confinement for young people in New York State, and many of my colleagues do the same across the country. And we've been somewhat successful, but the truth is we still do send young people to sit in prison cells for 23 hours a day with no human contact. So yeah, free them all is not just a visionary call, it is an urgent mandate. Okay, because when you think about all that I've just shared and will continue to share and put it in the context of a pandemic, what are we telling these people that we are leaving behind? Your life is just not worth us giving that much of a damn. And I can't live in a society like that. I won't allow myself to live in such a society. So every chance I get, I raise the call to free them all, not just for the children, not just for those who might not have been convicted of a violent crime. But yes, you know, people challenge me every day. Well, what about? And they give me a list of horrific crimes and people are convicted of murder and rape and other things that, yeah, we all find abhorrent. And, you know, I struggle with the question, but not with the answer. Yes, I do mean free them all. And as you will hear from my colleagues, it is something that we have to do. If we are as civilized a society as we claim to be, then we can't stand by and watch people live in these conditions during a pandemic. And I dare say ever. So as we continue this conversation and these presentations, I hope you think about what we mean when we say them all and who they all are. And right now we're focusing on children because, like as I said, so many of them are in these conditions that if we don't do something and do something immediately, they will contract the virus and, you know, likely die. And that is not where I want to see us land. So yes, free them all is what we call for. And we as an organization and me as an individual will certainly continue to challenge us to do just that. Can I go to the next slide? You know, there's also a level of freedom that might not show up as clearly as when we think about prisons, jails, and detention centers. There's the freedom from burden, right? A burden that children who have incarcerated parents live in ways that I can only imagine. I have a chance to work with young people of incarcerated parents very often. And when I sit down with them and hear the challenges that they face, it reminds me yet again that if we don't free them all, we are just limiting the growth and success of so many children who cannot have that full benefit of a family environment because we have incarcerated their moms and their dads at alarming rates. And yes, those kids look like my kids. Okay. So, you know, what are we talking about when we say free them all? We're really talking about an opportunity to rethink how we treat one another. And if we realize that there's a way to treat people that can keep us, quote unquote, safe, but also keep us humane and keep us decent, then let's do it. And I am convinced that the only way to do that at this point is to free them all. So I want to thank you for listening, and I'm sure that my colleagues will amplify what I said in ways that only they can. And, you know, I welcome challenging and encouraging questions, and look forward to engaging with you moving forward. So thank you. I think that one speaks for itself, so I'm just going to let that slide sit there. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Louis. And
Thank you.
again, thanks everyone for being here today. It's a real honor to be combining in this moment with all the good folks doing work around No Way to Treat a Child. And I think something you said, Brad, really struck me, that you could look at the experience of a 16-year-old being targeted in Palestine or in New York or in Atlanta, someone, a Black child, an immigrant child, a Palestinian child, and that there are very similar dynamics. And I felt these chills actually as you were talking, and you and Shannon were talking and sharing the stories of the recently detained Palestinian youth. And I felt similar experiences as Louis and I have been having a lot of conversations over the last several months since the pandemic began about the parallels between the system of mass incarceration in the US and the system of detention here in the US. And I think there are so many interesting and horrific parallels with detention all over the world. And so we've absolutely seen this really horrific cycle that has always existed, and at least in the time that our country has been grappling with immigration, but has gotten much worse in 2020 in some really distinct ways. And so I wanted to just highlight a few things that, especially, and like Louis, I want to particularly lean into the story of what's happening for migrant children and youth, but really talk about sort of migrants in general and then the system, what we're seeing around the system of detention in the US, of immigrant detention. But really to note that immigrant detention happens in the middle of this cycle. And so it's sort of at the beginning of that. And I think similar to some of the stories of militarization or being targeted by police that we hear, from Palestine or from New York or from other cities, that we see this really intense enforcement happening in the immigration world that then leads to then people being detained, and then ultimately in the immigration world leads to a cycle that includes deportation. And so families and communities being separated as people are being sent back to homes that many of them have fled from for all sorts of reasons and have built their life here, sometimes for decades. And so it's been a particularly interesting and challenging story during COVID, because at first actually we saw a slight pause in some of the enforcement and some of the deportation. And then there was sort of quietly a lot more sort of like low scale raids were happening and an increase in deportations. And just recently, we have heard as the detention numbers have drastically dropped. So this one slide sort of talks about how, a year ago, we were up to almost 50,000 immigrants in detention at any one moment in the year. And now we're down to only 16,000. But really that's about because of things we'll talk about in a second, of the ways that we've closed our borders, of the ways that we are stopping asylum seekers from even being able to have access to the due process that they are supposed to be having under international law and historic US law to be able to access migration. And so we see this cycle that it is embedded and sort of grounded in deep violence and militarization and in deep inhumanity in the way that Louis talks about. So by the time that people are being detained, that they are being detained in all sorts of different ways, either as they've approached the border and often also through enforcement actions here in the US, which do include raids and include anything from recently, we were working on the case of a gentleman, Binsar, who has been here for almost 20 years from Indonesia. And he was the caretaker of a church in Maryland. And ICE came to his doorstep a couple months ago. So they were there to check the battery on his ankle monitor. And then asked, that his wife actually even invited the ICE officials, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials inside for coffee. And then they said they couldn't get a good reading on the monitor, so they wanted him to come outside with them. And they took him outside, and then that was when they took him away in a van and took him to one of the most horrific facilities that we know in Georgia, which is a facility that some of you may have heard the story of, which there was a doctor who had performed unwanted hysterectomies on a number of women, and then the stories have kept coming out about the medical abuse in that facility. So there are all sorts of reasons that people end up in detention, and what the reasons that we see sort of the horrificness of immigrant detention today. You can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to highlight a couple things, as many of you may know or may not know, that the my system of migration is complex, and that would take us hours to kind of walk through. And so I just want to highlight a few things that have shifted and gotten worse under the Trump administration, and especially have gotten worse under COVID. And so we see again sort of the two sort of militaristic arms, of the enforcement arms of our immigration system, is ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or CBP, Customs and Border Protection, are often referred to as Border Patrol. And so we have seen the tactics of ICE continue to get more horrific. Again, this sort of clever way of going into communities and detaining people. And we've seen CBP even show up at protests this year. This was another first for these militaristic forces of really seeing sort of new way avenues that they were, sort of outside their traditional jurisdiction, which was already not great, but sort of seeing an increased militarization of communities. That's been coupled with a few ways that then we've also seen sort of migration being curtailed, and what has created a real mess at the southern border, in that we've got these couple policies and the migrant protection protocols, which has meant that people, as they're approaching the border, with again trying to seek asylum, are turned back almost immediately, and sort of sent back to wait on the other side for a hearing date, which had been at first a few weeks, but has then turned into months. And now for some folks, they've been waiting over a year. Another interesting dynamic of this that I did want to note is that what we've been learning is that there were some folks in the midst of this that were being kept even in hotel rooms on the U.S. side of the border, including families and especially Black immigrant families who were being kept outside of the ICE system, the CBP system, and were not being given their due process, as we again saw sort of the rights of migrants being carved away, and the increased militarization and tactics of these different forces of our Department of Homeland Security. And I think that brings us to a huge piece that we've been concerned about, is just the funding that goes to the Department of Homeland Security, that they have requested an insane amount of money, over $4 billion for this next fiscal year. And that comes at a time when they're requesting enough money to keep the detention bed level at over 45,000, which had been the old number, even though we're down to 16,000 today. And so even 16,000 is 16,000 beds too many, but we're deeply concerned about then what that would mean for the people that then could be put into this detention net. You can go to the next slide. I just wanted you to take a second just to look at this, just absorb this picture. If you don't know Freedom for Immigrants, I highly recommend that you Google them, and you can find this really important interactive map on their website. They are one of the best organizations that tracks detention facilities around the country. I think something to note about detention is that, one, it is vast and multi-layered. And so there are actually over 200 detention facilities all over the country. And many of them are actually spaces that are as common as county jails. And so guaranteed that for most of you, unless you're sort of way far up in the West where you can see lots of emptier space, but for many of us, we are not too far from an immigrant detention facility, from a county jail, or another sort of prison that is being used also as an ICE holding facility. There are a lot of private companies that have been making an insane amount of money on detaining and keeping up those detention bed numbers. And so it's not only a money making endeavor, but again, the inhumanity that happens in these facilities, as often it is incredibly challenging to get good information out about what are the practices and policies happening within these facilities. You know, the next slide. So I just wanted to uplift a couple things that are concerning, and I think are the stories also that we're hearing across the incarceration system as well, and some of the ways that people are being treated in this time behind bars and COVID. And again, as Lewis said, the urgent call to free them all is even more urgent because of this time of COVID, is that we are seeing an incredible lack of healthcare and protective equipment. We are even seeing people being denied healthcare. I just heard a story yesterday of a gentleman who was denied his inhaler because it could have been used as a weapon. And so people are being denied healthcare. People are having there's all sorts of malpractice. Again, the story of the women with the forced hysterectomies that happened in a facility in Georgia. We're seeing people having a lack of access to legal representation or even phone calls. Several jails recently that we've been hearing about, where they've been actually cutting off people's access to even make phone calls to their family members and to their legal teams. And COVID, it continues. We see massive outbreaks happening, both in the detention world for immigration and also in the incarceration world. And just a real concern, again, about the cycle of lack of protective equipment, healthcare, and outbreaks. We also see a very clever strategy of people being transferred from one facility to the next. And so really in ways that we're always a little bit concerned when we start to see the movement of people, which has happened with as one facility, and especially as we've seen actual victories through litigation of people being, there's being, a policy to release people. And we saw recently in Florida where the judge ruled that there should be 1,000 people released, and instead they were transferred from out of Florida into Georgia before they could be released. And so just really concerned about that, as we also are seeing, again, we've had over, just in this time of COVID alone, over 200,000 people being expelled, sort of again, sent back from the border. And that includes many, many Black migrants. And so deeply concerned about how this is directly impacting people of color in the midst of all this. Go to the next slide. So this is why we are putting out the call to free them all. I just want to highlight a couple things about this. And I dropped a bunch of links in the chat that you can feel free to peruse at your leisure. But I wanted to really especially just name that this is a campaign that came together at the beginning of COVID. And again, as Louis and I and others from both of our networks were sharing stories of some of the similar dynamics that we're seeing, and the deep concern that people have for family members and friends in facilities, and as they see the continued spread of COVID, but also just the ways that people are being treated, and knowing that, I think similar to some of the stories of the Palestinian children that you all are working on, is that there has to be a better way, that this cycle of militarization, of enforcement, of over incarceration has to stop. And so that's why we have been calling for Free Them All, that we have been working with at every level. Again, often it's at the county level, sometimes at the state level for state policies that different states are considering, to see both folks free, but also to end ICE contracts, to shut down particular horrific facilities, et cetera. So when you have a second, I just invite you to go. The first link really talks about the campaign in general and some of the framing and messaging of it. There's a toolkit that gets more into why the call to free them all, the different types of actions that folks are taking around this. And then finally, the list of actions. There's multiple national actions happening through our days of action. We're actually kicking off a National Week of Action this coming Thursday, which is International Human Rights Day, through the following Friday, which is International Migrants Day. And so through those days of action, there are going to be folks around the country who will be writing holiday cards to those who are detained or incarcerated, doing car caravans, so that people inside can hear sort of this call to freedom, and then also trying to do, get members of Congress and state legislators and governors to take notice of these situations. And then we're also going to be doing a phone zap, which is a creative way to do advocacy, virtual advocacy together over Zoom. And finally, there's going to be an interfaith service, just a space to really reflect and to hear more stories from folks. So the final thing I just want to close with real quick is, final slide, is that we do believe this is possible. We believe it's possible to get people released and possible to close down these facilities. On this final slide, you'll see that there was a huge victory we had last year that I think many of you knew about, which happened in Florida. The Homestead Child Detention Center in Florida was at the time the largest facility for migrant children in the country. At its height, it had over 3,000 children detained in rooms that look like this, with little access to the outside world, little ability to make phone calls to their families. And after months and months of advocacy of many children taking action and coming together, of getting the state legislators and the federal and our members of Congress to be present and to try and put pressure on the company that was contracting with ICE around this, they finally closed their doors last August, and all of the children were either sent to sponsors or sent to smaller facilities where they were then going through the process to be reunited. So we believe it's possible to free them all, and we are going to continue to organize around it, even as we grapple with sort of all of the layers of what decarcerating means in this time. So I'll toss it over to Panel.
Thanks, Kristen. So I know we are slowly approaching the hour, so I'm going to keep this brief. I think the reason why I'm sort of giving participants today a view of what's happening at the federal level is because, like what Kristen and Lewis have said, there's so many atrocities, there's so many human rights violations. And Brad made a very important point where he's like, are we asking the Israeli government or the Israeli military to hold themselves accountable, to investigate themselves? In the US here, we've had an issue in the past 4 years, a bit more pronounced in the past 4 years, but really has been an issue for a long time coming, where there has been a lack of accountability. There's been a lack of accountability in Congress of where money is being spent, of what we're using our funds on. There's been a lack of accountability in the way the government implements these things, the values that they spend our money on as taxpayers in the United States. And so with each election, we encourage people to vote as a moral vote, like a moral value. Vote where you want to see your tax dollars spent, things you want to see done. And so we all have multiple dreams and goals: end in detention, end in mass incarceration, more funds towards healthcare, education. A lot of these policy goals as individuals stand, and it is up to obviously the division in Congress, whether it's more Democratic, more conservative, more Republican, for us to see some of these goals materialize. So in the past election, just for a recap, we know that the House Democrats that were once the majority still remained the majority, but lost some of their seats to Republican offices. And on the Senate side, the House Democrats did not gain seats either. We know that there's a race in Georgia in January that we're slowly approaching, but watching closely to see how that ends up. I think what's important to note is that incarceration is not a Democratic thing or Republican thing. It's an American thing. Both sides of the aisle fund it at alarming rates. Both sides of the aisle lean into the tough on crime to appease a certain base. And when they try to appease a certain base, they end up the brown and black communities across the United States and internationally suffer for that campaign goal. In specifics to things that have to do with Palestine and policy goals that have to do with Palestine, in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we were hoping to see a more progressive chairperson, which held the possibility of having Palestinian voices on panels. However, that did not happen, but that does not stop the advocacy. Just to say that as we see new people come into Congress, with on the House side, the progressive squad, the infamous squad, getting larger, having more people in there, we're able to bring more of these policy goals and more of these demands of our Congress people to the forefront. But we also expect the same issues on gridlock. Just because there's a new administration doesn't mean Congress is going to start doing things much quicker. We still have a bunch of members that are not strong on a lot of issues, that are wishy-washy on a lot of issues, that change their minds after promising and committing to certain things on the campaign trail. And so the next 2 years in Congress is for us to hold them accountable. And so if Congress will not hold themselves accountable, if the administration will not hold itself accountable, we, the constituents, we, the residents, we, the taxpayers, have to hold them accountable. Next slide, please. The Biden-Harris transition has started. We're seeing a lot of Obama-era officials coming back to the forefront. We're seeing the transition team heavily represented by corporations and think tanks. It almost feels like we're going back to 4 years ago, and that is not the goal. For issues to do with incarceration, for issues to do with detention, for issues to do with Palestinian children, incarcerated, detained, or even the Palestinian Israel state, 4 years ago was not blissful. And so we need to push back on the narrative that we just need to get to pre-Trump era. We need to begin to dream bigger and vision what we want to see, which is why the Freedom All is not tied to any campaign. The Freedom All call does not call on the Trump administration alone. It calls on all of us. It calls on people who still see incarceration as the solution to poverty, still see incarceration as a solution to mental health issues, still sees incarceration as the solution to homelessness. We need to begin to challenge those narratives. And we need an administration that sees that and hears the voice of the people as we uplift those goals. Next slide, please. And so the Biden-Harris administration have put out a couple of policy goals. obviously COVID-19 response is on the forefront. But we know that incarceration is a public health crisis. You cannot solve the COVID-19 issue in the United States without addressing the fact that prisons, jails, detention centers are hotbeds for this disease to grow. And so we continue within the Freedom All movement, we continue to call on the administration to prioritize decarcerating people from detention centers and prisons as a COVID-19 response. In COVID-19, solitary confinement, a violation of human rights, and something that is torture has been used to keep people away from each other. Solitary confinement is the prison social distancing. That does not solve anything and further aggravates issues that people were dealing with before they were incarcerated. And so within the COVID-19 response, and which seems like a priority for this administration, we're saying decarcerate people. And those demands go across also to the No Way to Treat a Child campaign. No child, no individual should be wading through a public health crisis in a cell, in a cage, in a prison, away from the support of their communities. Next slide, please. And these are just some of the Biden-Harris promises that they've made on detention and incarceration to decarcerate prisons. A lot of this can be signed into law by the administration themselves. Some of these as well have to be pushed through Congress. And like I shared earlier, both parties need to be on the same page. And the only way they can be on the same page is if we continue to lobby for our priorities, if we continue to lobby for moral goals that help people without hurting people, continue to push for a fact that we cannot build an economy on incarceration. That was slavery. We cannot continue like that. We need to push back. We need to dream bigger. We need to change things. Mistakes have been made, yes, but that does not mean we need to continue making the same mistakes. We need to see that our communities deserve transformative justice, restorative justice, rather than incarceration and criminal, quote unquote, justice as a solution to issues in our community. Thank you.
Miranda?
Yeah, would we like to take a question or two? I know we're really coming up on the time limit here. What do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, we're not really going to have enough time to to take very many, but maybe one kind of thread that you saw, Miranda, in the questions.
Sure thing.
Otherwise, people can also email us, and we can get them responses via our email.
Sure. Yeah, Pat had an interesting question shared earlier, flagging that in Palestine, youth can be imprisoned under administrative detention without being charged with a crime. And Pat's question was, is that the case in the US? To anyone's knowledge, in any way, legally or in practice, as far as like the different ways that people can be detained?
Is it okay if I give it a stab? Okay. It's a challenging question because the law says that in the criminal justice system, there should not be any detention without charge, right? However, the practice is that often that does happen. The system in our criminal justice system requires different levels of charging. So the police can do their own initial charge, and that by itself can lead to detention. Ideally, you want to have the judicial system go through a process of grand jury, if there's a felony charge, or some sort of information if there's a lower level criminal charge. But often the detention starts as soon as the police decide that you are more likely than not to have committed an offense. So yeah, unfortunately, people are detained, children and adults, before being charged in the criminal justice system in our country.
Makes sense. Folks, I know we had a few other questions come through the chat. If you have a question that we haven't covered, please do send us an email to info@nowaytotreatachild.com. Someone from our team will be happy to help you out. And we'll send over an email later this week with the recording of this webinar and all the links that were shared in the chat. So don't worry about saving those. We'll make sure you get them.
Yeah. Brad, do you want to say something about next month's webinar?
Yeah, just to flag for folks that we don't have a firm date for the January 2021 webinar, but we're hoping most likely we'll sort of go back to our second Tuesday. I have no idea what date that is or what else is happening, but that's what's worked for us in the past. So we'll try to do that, and you'll all get an update once we have that. The focus will be looking at the incoming 117th Congress, looking at specific opportunities that we have, we think we have, and talking through kind of what we're going to be doing and going for, starting off with the first 100 days. So it'll be exciting, I think, and refreshing. And we've got a lot of work to do between now and then to kind of take the bills and the legislation that we've done and figure out kind of what we're doing and how far we can push and what we can garner support for. But it's exciting. The new Congress, fresh start, taking the momentum that we've built and turning it into something new and continuing to push for basic rights and freedom for Palestinians. So join us.
Yes, thank you, Brad. And thank you, Kristen and Peniel and Lewis, for joining us. I know from the comments that a lot of people want to take this recording and share it with their friends and send it to their senators and their representatives. It was great to have you on, and hopefully this won't be the last time. We'd love to invite you back in for our great community that's advocating for children's rights in Palestine and here in the United States. So thank you all for joining us, and have a good end of this year.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.